I don't know what my role is anymore.
Those 8 words, spoken by Ezra Klein to Ta-Nehisi Coates in a podcasted conversation last month, have echoed around my head ever since I first heard them. First in a clipped TikTok, and then twice more as I listened and re-listened to the full conversation. My first impulse was simply to dunk. Klein's role of professional political opinion haver is, after all, a pretty strange one these days. In an era where anyone can share their thoughts on the events of the day to X or TikTok, the idea that some people get paid to do so feels almost quaint. When the analysis is as weak as Charlie Kirk was practicing politics the right way, it's easy to wonder if it's time to admit that the whole newspaper opinion writer game has run its course. And yet, the more I've thought about it, the more I've realised that Klein's uncertainty wasn't trivial. It isn't just him. So much of our collective political debate right now seems to be shaped by a widespread confusion about what any of our roles in that debate should be. That confusion runs throughout Klein's conversation with Coates. It shapes the whole of the fiery debates which followed Charlie Kirk's death and much of his career. And it was the driving force behind the exasperating complaints about cancel culture and wokeness which dominated the last decade. The internet has completely blown open the gates to the metaphorical public square. Almost anyone can speak, and with a genuine chance that they might be heard. That's been a powerful shift. We've gained access to countless new voices, many of whom would never have had the social capital to become opinion writers at the New York Times. But that flattening of the public sphere can also be weaponized. Politicians and celebrities complain about online criticism as if they're just ordinary posters getting cyberbullied. Users with minuscule followings only need to have one post go viral to end up facing levels of scrutiny once reserved for heads of state. Journalists mistake fleeting trends for vibrant political movements. And, most troublingly, authoritarian presidents find that they can use the social media posts of private citizens to justify campaigns of retribution against their opponents.
Can you answer that? Can you say what I think it's a good point. Would you define for me how you see, what your role is?
I don't know what my role is anymore.
I need to start by clarifying that when Ezra Klein blurted out those 8 fateful words, he wasn't trying to make a point about the changed role of newspaper opinion writers in an age of social media. His concern was about what his role should be as a writer in an age of political violence. The parade of political assassinations which have rocked American politics over the past year seems to him to raise the prospect that the pen might not be mightier than the gun. Coates' response was that it never has been. Assassinations are shocking, they are tragic, they are destabilizing. But they only feel uniquely so because America has allowed other forms of political violence, police killings, school shootings, mass incarceration, to become so routine. If, for Klein, politics is primarily an intellectual pursuit, Coates reminded him that, for many, it has always been about the distribution of violence. Those 8 words then first stuck in my head out of a desire to be snarky. Watching Klein repeatedly bat away Coates' heartfelt pleas to recognise that politics can be life or death for so many people was deeply frustrating. I, like so many other people, wanted to scream, well, maybe you don't have a role anymore, Ezra. But Klein's detachment actually drives to the heart of so much of the confusion surrounding who gets to participate in public debate and how. See, most of our conversations about political discourse are awful. Really awful. We get endlessly bogged down in simplified debates about free speech, which imagine a neat spectrum with completely free speech on one end and total censorship on the other, with pretty much everyone advocating for a move towards the former. The reality, however, is that most people's access to free speech is shaped less by formal censorship than by time, money, and their social and professional networks. We don't come to political debates as equals. We enter these conversations wearing very different roles, facing very different stakes, and with very different relationships to real-world power. Without getting too cute, I've come to think of political debate as a kind of RPG, in which we all score very differently across a number of underlying attributes. 3 stand out as most consequential. The first, and the one which is the most relevant to Klein and Coates' exchange, is what I'd call groundedness. A New York Times columnist discussing whether or not the Democrats should run pro-life candidates is simply playing a different game to someone who is worried about having to drive 2 hours to the nearest clinic. The former might enter this conversation with a wealth of real or affected expertise, built from consuming as much analysis as possible. And that can be useful, but the stakes are very different for those with first-hand experience than for those for whom it's simply a theoretical exercise. Klein's detachment was made even harder to swallow by his pretty high score of what we might call professionalism. Both Klein and Coates take part in debates about politics because they're paid to. That doesn't mean that they don't believe what they say, but it does mean that they have more time to develop their thoughts and often a whole infrastructure to propel their opinions out into the world. These are resources not available to some TikToking activist, which can be especially frustrating when the resulting analysis feels less than astute. Completing the triad is powerfulness. Most of us talk about politics because we want things to change, and argument is our only real tool for making that happen. But that's not true for everyone. Some people also have direct or indirect access to real political power. Donald Trump clearly sees some benefit to posting on Truth Social, but he doesn't have to. He could just sign an executive order and be done with it. For some then, political debate is a nice to have rather than a necessity. Taken together, these three attributes form what I'm calling the political opinion haver cube. And as interesting as it is to map where different political actors might sit on that cube, it's even more striking how obvious those positions used to be. As recently as a couple of decades ago, untangling the politicians from the NGO workers and the grassroots petition organisers was pretty easy. The internet has changed all of that, and the effect on our ability to have meaningful political conversations has been devastating.
Now listen, you
right of
queer,
assembly
stop
is
calling
here.
me a crypto-Nazi.
Let's stop
or I'll
calling
slap
names
you in
and
your
let's get-
goddamn face, and
let's-
you'll stay plastered.
Arguing about politics was so much easier before the internet. As late as the 2000s, political discourse happened in two pretty distinct spaces. On the one hand was the public political debate which happened in newspapers, books, and on TV. Here, pundits clashed on panel shows. Newspaper columnists acted like unacknowledged pen pals, exchanging point and counterpoint throughout the week. Economists and sociologists wrote books outlining their preferred policies. At the other side of a 20-foot barbed wire fence were the largely private political debates, which took place in pubs and front rooms, at water coolers and dinner tables. Here, family and friends chided one another for supporting this politician or that. Drunkards lectured anyone who would listen on how they would do a far better job if given half the chance. There was plenty which separated these two worlds from one another, but the most important were tone and participation. When Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley Jr. famously debated one another on ABC News in the 1960s, both were aware that they weren't just trying to convince the man in front of him to change his mind. They were performing a debate for an audience. This makes for a very different kind of conversation than if one is talking about politics with a family member. A chat over dinner might actually be coarser in the use of language and strength of opinion than a TV debate, although Buckley and Vidal's debates were plenty heated.
Stop
Assembly is
calling me
here.
a crypto-Nazi.
Let's stop
or I'll
calling
slap
names
you in
and
your
let's get-
goddamn face.
While you might be more willing to shout and swear in front of your friends, however, you're also conversely more likely to be open to compromise and concession. These are your friends after all. More than this, in a private conversation, you have the ability to air half-thought-out ideas and to process feelings out loud in a way that might be embarrassing in any kind of public forum. TV, radio, and newspapers are generally places for people who believe themselves to have everything figured out already. Which brings us on to the biggest chasm between these private and public debates, and that is that you or I and most other people on planet Earth would never have been invited to take part in the latter. To participate in the public political debate all but required that you scored pretty high on our professionalism and powerfulness attributes, which in turn often meant people who weren't particularly grounded in their experience of most topics affecting ordinary people. This division was elitist. It kept ordinary people's views out of the media and allowed for a great deal of consent manufacturing. But it was also a world in which you kind of knew where everyone stood. The very fact that someone was debating directly with a politician on TV rather than simply moaning to you in a coffee shop said something about their place in the world and their access to power. The internet, and social media in particular, took a bulldozer to the wall which separated these two worlds. We sometimes think of this as having been a pretty one-way process. We imagine that the internet simply gave non-professional opinion havers access to the public political debate, which is true to an extent, but as so many of us flocked to sign up to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, we carried with us much of the style of debate which previously would have been confined to those pub and dinner time arguments. The result is that modern social media is a Frankenstein's monster of two very different kinds of political conversation. On the one hand, it brings together two different types of people, the powerful and the powerless. Politicians, journalists, and academics are forced to share space with retail workers, plumbers, and nurses. But it also fuses two very different types of conversation. Press releases, breaking news, public service announcements, and carefully worded think pieces all sit alongside memes, TikTok ranks, snarky Twitter threads, and influencer hot takes. Weirder still, these types of conversation aren't necessarily associated with the type of person that you might assume them to be. For every politician that's learnt to shitpost, there's an average Joe who responds to every tragic event in the news with a sort of official statement. Internet theorists often refer to this kind of confusion as context collapse. When you post a TikTok or tweet, you do so as a certain person with a certain position on our political opinion haver cube. You also probably post with a specific intention and with a reasonably specific audience in mind. But social media doesn't care about that. The minute that you hit post, all of that context is stripped. That can be frustrating when a TikTok posted with one intent for a very specific audience, quote unquote, breaks containment, and is jumped on by a different audience which interprets it very differently. But as viewers, it can make it pretty hard to decode exactly what we're watching or reading at any given time. This is not only a world in which JD Vance's tweets and TikToks exist on the same platform as yours, but it's one in which they share the exact same font and aesthetic. Think about that. There is nothing to formally distinguish your tweets from those of the Vice President of the United States of America. The ramifications of this process of context collapse are extremely far-reaching. But what I want to focus on today is the massive opportunity that it's opened up for bad actors. The melting of the wall between the public and private debate often make it possible for folks with significant political power, or whom are paid highly for their analysis, to act as if they're just everyday folks having their say. It also presents the opportunity to pretend that random internet users are far more powerful than they actually are, with increasingly terrifying results. Often, this is completely intentional, and we'll get to that shortly. But what's fascinating is that there's also a subset of journalists and politicians and celebrities who don't even seem to realise that they're doing it. Watching Ezra Klein dig himself deeper and deeper into a hole whilst trying to explain himself to a very patient Ta-Nehisi Coates, it was tempting to think that he was simply grasping at straws when faced with each new question. But if there was a common theme which ran throughout Klein's contributions to that conversation, it was a complete inability to locate himself and others on our political opinion haver cube, and to recognise what roles and responsibilities might come with those coordinates.
All of that is understandable, but I guess, was silence not an option?
Yeah, silence to me was not grieving with people.
This clip here is a fascinating distillation of a delusion which seems to have infected the minds of an embarrassing number of journalists, politicians, and celebrities. Let's call it context collapse confusion. See, it's quite popular to point out that social media has convinced many ordinary people that they're minor celebrities. But there's a reverse phenomenon in which context collapse has caused quite a few celebrities with massive platforms to think that they're just like the rest of us. This isn't the case for everyone. Head to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's Instagram page and you'll find a pretty brand-safe profile dominated by posts promoting his films. Others, however, quickly went native. Take J.K. Rowling or Graham Linehan or Elon Musk. Much has been said about how each of these figures have had their views shaped by social media addiction. But the velocity of their journeys to the extremes has been less the result of passive consumption than of social media pushback. In fact, so many of the self-anointed martyrs of the cancel culture wars of the 2010s seem to be driven not so much by an allegiance to the specific causes that they chose to attach themselves to, than by a deep resentment towards the idea that they might need to give a bit more thought to what they post online than you or I. They saw the carefree abandon with which ordinary people would post their thoughts and wanted to be able to do the same. When figures like Rowling instead found people criticising them and their works, they were indignant, as though some inalienable human right not to be criticised had been breached. I can tell you from personal experience that being criticised online isn't nice. I've taken my fair share of online dunkings, some deserved, others less so. I've had to read whole threads of people who can't even themselves quite articulate why they don't like me, and that's rough. But I've also come to view it as probably unavoidable. You simply can't please everyone, and some of those people are going to express their displeasure in quite nasty ways. The cancel culture narrative often put this down to a certain cultural decline. We were told that people had gotten meaner and less forgiving than they used to be. The reality, however, is far less dramatic. If authors, comedy writers, and expensive firework manufacturers are forced to read more criticism of themselves than they might have used to have been, that's not so much a result of there being more criticism around as it is a result of the destruction of that boundary between our public political debates and our private ones. People being mean about celebrities is simply not new. When I was a teenager, my friends and I hated Axl Rose for supposedly, I think, breaking up Guns N' Roses. I'm sure we said some pretty mean things about him. It was only by historical happenstance that we weren't able to amplify those thoughts through TikTok or Twitter. The wall between public and private didn't make us better people, but it did stop Rose from having to hear or read our thoughts. The fact of the matter is that a great number of people engage with social media in much the same way that they previously would have engaged in a political or cultural debate among friends. When politicians complain about being on the receiving end of mean comments on social media, they're often complaining about the modern day equivalent of someone shouting at the TV. It can be deeply unpleasant to read such comments, as it is when I have to read shitty comments under my videos. But people saying mean things about politicians, journalists, and celebrities, unfortunately, isn't that novel. In fact, the idea that such figures should be able to use social media platforms with the same carefree abandon as most other people is kind of unreasonable. A quick glance at our political opinion havercube reminds us that politicians, journalists, and other traditional public figures are coming to the conversation from a very different position than your average anonymous TikTok user. They're not only likely to have a far larger audience than anyone who responds to their posts, they're not only likely to be better paid, but many have got much more direct access to political power too. When they wade into topics that they know very little about, the stakes are far lower. If they can't use social media like the rest of us, it's kind of because they're not. And it's only a result of context collapse confusion that they think that they might be. Which brings us back to this.
All of that is understandable, but I guess, was silence not an option?
Yeah, silence to me was not grieving with people.
Early on in Klein's conversation with Coates, the former is telling the latter about the emotional hurricane that he, like so many other people, was swept up by when hearing of Charlie Kirk's death. Coates' response is to ask why, given all these complicated feelings, it felt necessary to write anything on the topic at all. If he was so conflicted and confused, why not sit this one out? Why not wait until thoughts had taken on a more solid shape? To which this is his response.
Yeah, silence to me was not grieving with people.
There might have been far more consequential cases of context collapse confusion, but I've rarely seen examples this far advanced. Because this is a startling example of how the impacts of context collapse have begun to spread beyond social media and into other aspects of our public political debates too. Because here, Klein seems to want Coates and us to view his column in the New York Times through the same lens as we would view a conversation that he'd had in private with a friend. But at risk of stating the obvious, writing a newspaper column isn't grieving with people. At best, it's grieving with a Microsoft Word document. I've gone back and forth with how genuine I think this statement is. One of the biggest consequences of context collapse is how often it allows people to try and dance around our political opinion havocube. I thought about this a lot following Natalie Wynn of ContraPoints' statement on the genocide in Gaza. The context here was that Wynn had come under criticism for a perceived lack of public acknowledgement of the situation, which eventually led her to release a frustrated statement which seemed affronted at the idea that people might expect her to comment. Reading it, it felt as if she'd approached writing that statement with a view of herself as scoring pretty low on our professionalism scale. She actively talked down her own work to make it sound trivial, lowbrow, unserious. The difficulty is that I don't think that this is how she would like us to view her work on the occasions when she releases videos. Those videos are often silly. They contain numerous gags. And yet, it would be disingenuous to suggest that they don't also clearly aspire to a certain level of rigor and prestige. She attempts to make big claims about the world we live in, the human condition, and political strategy. When we're watching her videos, she absolutely wants us to view her as someone high up that professionalism scale. Not least because those videos generate significant revenue. Intentionally, or simply as the result of a case of context collapse confusion, then there's a certain dance being carried out, of wanting to be seen to occupy different positions on our cube depending on what suits at any given time. If we viewed Wynn as less professional when her videos came out, we might take her analysis less seriously. We might believe that self-caricature of someone who simply pours milk on dolls and chats about Twilight. If we view Wynn as a professional political commentator outside of those windows of video release, however, we might expect her to have something to offer in terms of interpreting a major, frankly inescapable event in international politics. Ezra Klein is, again intentionally or otherwise, engaged in a very similar dance here. When he sat down to write that infamous piece about Charlie Kirk practicing politics the right way, he was absolutely attempting to take up the mantle of Ezra Klein, establishment opinion columnist at the top of his game who can sum up the mood of a nation. Professional, powerful, analytical. When that didn't go as intended, he quickly reframed himself as just a guy trying to hash out his feelings among a small group of friends. Never mind that those friends were 11.9 million New York Times subscribers. This is the first danger of context collapse in the political sphere. It allows people with significant power and platforms to imagine that status away, with all kinds of negative consequences. It can lead to journalists writing bad articles because they've forgotten they're likely one of the highest paid columnists in the world. In the UK, it has often led to politicians struggling to distinguish between criticism and abuse in ways which risk crackdowns on speech rights. The bigger danger of context collapse, however, is the inverse opportunity. Because context collapse also allows bad actors to reframe half-thought-out posts by random internet users which are made with the same intention and affect which previously would have been associated with private debate as instead intentional, carefully worded public statements. Worse still, it presents an opportunity for portraying ordinary people with little power at all as being at the heart of a deadly conspiracy in need of either heavy criticism or worse, state repression.
If we would have said that Joy Reid and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson Lee and Ketanji Brown Jackson were affirmative action picks, we would have been called the racist. But now they're coming out and they're saying it for us. They're coming out and they're saying, I'm only here because of affirmative action. Yeah, we know. you do not have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken really seriously.
The notion that Charlie Kirk was practicing politics the right way is grounded in several layers of context collapse confusion. Firstly, because Charlie Kirk's life's work danced incessantly on the border between public and private debate. Viewed through the sympathetic lens which Ezra Klein applied to his career, Kirk was someone who went to college campuses with the desire of, quote, talking with anyone who would talk to him. In a world of so much online fire and fury, this was a guy who went to meet people face to face in the real world. More than this, he went to locations where he could have expected a hostile reception. Except that's not what was going on when Charlie Kirk rocked up to a college campus at all. For one, he held a very different position on our political opinion haver cube than anyone he was likely to talk to. He wasn't just some random podcaster, he had donor money coming out of his eyeballs, and a direct line to the President of the United States. He wasn't meeting his debatees on a level playing field at all. More importantly though, as so many people have pointed out, the actual conversations on the ground at his events weren't the end product. His events were the raw material for a slurry of conservative outrage slop. Kirk's whole shtick involved taking conversations which had happened in a specific time and place between specific human beings speaking face to face, stripping them of that context and transposing them into the depersonalized global content sphere. If Kirk had one key talent, it was in being able to leverage context collapse to incredible emotional effect. If Kirk's practicing of politics the right way was grounded in context collapse, however, so is the notion that the left or liberals or whomever have been practicing politics the wrong way. This belief has become a pretty widespread common sense notion among the media class. But there was a particularly egregious moment in Ezra Klein's conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates which perfectly articulates its ridiculousness. About 15 minutes in, this happens.
I've been obsessing recently for a piece I've been writing about the Hillary Clinton deplorables comment, and I want to play it.
You know, to just be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables.
Klein is trying to substantiate the idea that American liberals have been too mean to Trump supporters. Rather than trying to win them over, he suggests that they've decided that anyone who would even consider voting for Trump is already beyond saving. The result being that those Trump voters have only gotten more passionate about the guy, to the point that he won another election. Hillary Clinton's speech seems like a pretty good example of this supposed phenomenon. And yet, Clinton's speech was also delivered in 2016. That's 9 years ago. If this trend of mean liberalism is so inescapable as to constitute some great national disaster, surely Klein would be able to find a more recent example than this. And yeah, he could. We all know that he could, astonishingly easily. It would take a minuscule amount of time and effort to head to TikTok or probably Blue Sky and screen cap thousands of examples. The difficulty is that vanishingly few of them would be politicians, especially not with the standing of a Hillary Clinton. The vast majority would instead be outright amateurs on our professionalism scale. They might also tack pretty strongly towards the experience end of our groundedness scale. People who aren't being mean about Republicans for the hell of it, but because Trump's policies have caused them and their loved ones very real harm. In opting to instead pick that clip of Hillary Clinton, Klein was rightly realizing that the alternative option of inviting multi-award-winning writer Ta-Nehisi Coates into the New York Times offices to have a serious debate over whether Digimon Rememberer 99 should tone down their language would be absolutely fucking insane. It's certainly easier to find more examples of liberals being mean about conservatives in public in the 2020s than it might have been in the year 2000. It's also extremely easy to find examples of conservatives being mean about liberals and leftists. I don't love it either. But the root cause? It's not some great new moral rot, it's context collapse. For the most part, liberal politicians and spokespeople who would previously have existed solely within the sphere of public political debate still do act with grace and decorum towards their opponents. The people that you see being nasty about one another would probably have been just as likely to have been being nasty about one another 20 years ago, they just would have done so behind closed doors. The independent variable here is context collapse. The internet has simply given us this dreadful ability to eavesdrop on people who hate us. I don't think that Ezra Klein's wish that everyone could be a bit nicer to one another online is a bad one. And yet, I do think there's something a little worrying about expecting people to be. Klein might even sincerely think that he's using his role at the New York Times to hold power to account here. But if he does, his thinking has been severely warped by context collapse confusion. Because internet shitposters and TikTok ranters don't have any power. And while Klein's suggestion that they do might seem pretty silly on its own, an embrace of the same lie by conservatives risks having devastating effects.
Antifa beats journalists. Antifa attacks our police stations. They attack our courthouses. They dox our law enforcement officers. No more. They are a terrorist group, and we are coming after them.
6 days before Ezra Klein sat down for his conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates, Donald Trump signed an executive order designating Antifa a domestic terrorist organization. Which is easy to laugh off. As many of you will know, Antifa isn't even an organization in the first place. Antifa is an idea which individuals and usually small autonomous groups can and will claim an alignment with. There's no headquarters to raid or leadership to lock up. In truth though, conservatives have long preferred to fight made-up enemies. The Red Scare was fun and all, but the existence of an actual meaningful communist party meant it was too easy for undesirables who weren't and had never been a member of the Communist Party to prove their innocence. There was a lot more room to maneuver once the Berlin Wall had fallen, and you could just call Barack Obama a socialist with little pushback. This was always the masterstroke of wokeness. Rather than attacking a specific organization or political party or movement, it allowed conservatives to create a collage of all of the disparate things that they didn't like. Black History Month, getting vaccinated, and working from home could all be presented as the formal policies of a unified enemy. And because there was no Wokemeister General who could hold a press conference and rebut any accusations, their claims would just exist in the media sphere unopposed. Anti-wokeness frequently leveraged context collapse to political ends in this way. Culture warriors on The Daily Wire, GB News, and other right-wing networks repeatedly pulled up random internet posts and attempted to convince their viewers that the TikToks of people with very little in the way of power or professionalism on our political opinion havacube mattered as much or more than whatever actual politicians were up to that week. Trump's crackdown on Antifa threatens to go one step further. In a world where context collapse has begun to bleed from social media into all aspects of our political and public life, his administration has recognized that this gives them carte blanche to apply their own context to their political enemies. Thus, everyday anti-Trump protesters, Democratic Party officials, the alleged assassins of Charlie Kirk and Brian Thompson, online posters, and George Soros all end up bundled up in what Stephen Miller called a continuum of violence. From one perspective, the idea that George Soros is a big fan of the Black Bloc is clearly ludicrous. But there'll be many out there who will eat up this recontextualization hook, line, and sinker. It's hard to know what should be done about all of this, if anything can be. This, unfortunately, isn't a solutions-y kind of video. There was meant to be a 20-minute reflection, which simply got massively out of hand. We began with those 8 words from Ezra Klein's deeply frustrating exchange with Ta-Nehisi Coates. I don't know what my role is anymore. The real challenge is that the internet has made it hard to tell what anyone's role is anymore. It has become easier than ever for the powerful to act weak and for the marginalized to be placed under the kind of scrutiny we used to reserve for heads of state. If we can't work out a way to see through that confusion, then our politics is only going to get more confusing and frustrating in the future. And you know what else can be confusing and frustrating? When you expect a nice smooth shave from a multi-blade razor, but then the whole thing is ruined by irritation and razor burn. That's where Henson Shaving comes in. Henson Shaving are very kindly back sponsoring today's video, which I'm excited about because I really love my Henson Shaving razor. And Henson are on a mission to make it easier than ever to embrace the simplicity, ease, and cost effectiveness of safety razors. In place of expensive plasticky cartridges, safety razors use much cheaper, far more environmentally friendly razor blades, like, oh, careful with my fingers, Tom, this one. Which might seem a little daunting, but Henson makes it super easy. Henson's razors are designed to expose just the right amount of blade at just the right angle, whilst also providing the blade with consistent support for the smoothest of shapes. I first got into using a safety razor primarily for the environmental benefits of being able to use just some aluminium rather than plastic, but they're not only better for the environment, they're better for you too. Henson have been doing a bunch of research into the impacts of using a safety razor, and so far their findings are fascinating. They found that the Henson razor actually significantly lowers razor burn in comparison to your regular multi-blade razor. I've been using this Henson razor for a couple of years now, and the upgrade from using a multi-blade one back in the day is night and day. It consistently manages an even shave, and the quality of materials and manufacturing just makes it an all-round nice product to use in the morning. The days of constantly irritated skin are long behind me. And of course, this being a YouTube sponsorship, I have a little deal to offer you too. If you head to hensonshaving.com/TomNicholas and use the code TomNicholas at checkout, then you'll get a pack of 100 blades for free with the purchase of a razor. If you're anything like me, those blades will last you quite some time. In fact, I just Googled the last pack of blades that I bought off Amazon. I think I've got 100 of them. That was over a year ago, and I still have 3/4 of them left. That link again is hensonshaving.com/TomNicholas. Happy shaving, everybody! Which means that all that's left to do is for me to say a massive thank you to the people who support my work over at the top tier of my Patreon page, who are Richard, Gary, Dick on Spain, Bill Mitchell, ZC Reese, Zoe Alden, Alexander Blank, Niels Bildgaard, Sophia R, Sergio Suarez, Richard Rapoon, Amit Singh Parahar, Gabriel Koch, Jimmy Dunn, Fiasco Linguini, Agent Maxwell, Glenn Sugden, Emil, Jarabar, Yillamson, Paulius Edicus, Sam Fortunato, Sondra Yarsenjean, and Douglas Urquhart. If you want to support them in getting access to watch early bits of stuff that we're working on before it goes live, my weekly blog, the Friday Update, copies of scripts to videos, and a bunch of other stuff, then you can find out how to do so at patreon.com/TomNicholas. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I'll see you in the next video.